Good morning. My name is Bryn, and I'm one of the pastors at Highrock North Shore, and I'm so glad to be worshiping with you this morning. A special hello to our Sanctuary Watch Party crew, which also includes me. So hello, future Bryn from YouTube Bryn. Well, I recently watched a documentary about a software developer named Frederick Brennan. In 2013, Fred had an idea. He wanted to create an online forum where people could say anything that they wanted, any way that they wanted to say it. It would be a sanctuary for free speech, a place where you could post anything at any time and no one would judge you or filter you or moderate you. It would be the wild, wild west world of the internet. No rules, no filters, no consequences. It would be a place for all the words you were too afraid to say out loud because, as Brennan believed, what's said on the internet stays on the internet. What happens here is just words for the wind. It's a website you can click on and off with a finger and go back to your actual life. The internet, after all, isn't actually real life. It's just the internet. Your words are safe there, right? So his site, 8chan, it could be a safe haven for people who needed to get their words out, a container for hate speech that needed an outlet somewhere. Trouble was, the internet and real life aren't two separate worlds. Not even for you, future Bryn, watching YouTube Bryn. What happens on the internet, it doesn't start on the internet, and it doesn't stay on the internet. Brennan learned the hard way that what's said on the internet can be a spark that can set a whole forest on fire. One day, an angry manifesto was posted on 8chan. Now, most 8chan users dismissed the manifesto as an angry rant. Some even shared it, believing that no fingers that typed this would actually pull the trigger on their threats. But then one day, they did. The poster took his threats to a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and then he posted a live feed while he took the lives of 50 people. Another shooter in Poway, California did the same, and another in El Paso, Texas. Over the course of 6 months, perpetrators of 3 different mass shootings announced their plans, posting manifestos, and even live feeds of their actions on 8chan. And then their posts, they got celebrated and shared like wildfire. After a while, 8chan, it wasn't some innocent haven for people to vent their frustrations about coworkers or to tell off-color jokes to an audience that would cheer them on. Over time, it became a breeding ground for racism, sexism, extremism, and radicalization. By this point, Brennan had sold the website, and he had started following Jesus. And because of his newfound faith, he decided that he was completely done with 8chan. He disavowed it. He called for it to be taken down entirely, declaring that unfettered free speech has real-life consequences, that what we say on the internet is what happens in the real world. But Fred's calls for change happened too late. The site's current owner, Jim Watkins, announced that his company, quote, had no intention of deleting constitutionally protected hate speech. And by 2017, an anonymous 8chan poster, known only as Q, had started to gather quite a following on the site. Q claimed that they were a government official with Q-level clearance, and they made thousands of posts that accused high-profile government officials and Hollywood elites of all kinds of unthinkable atrocities. And thousands of 8chan users believed QAnon. Over the course of just a few years, this conspiracy theory developed a following among Americans from sea to shining sea, from rural Midwest to New York City. Even some congressional figures started to follow the theories. You may know someone who does. And eventually, through 8chan, this website that bragged that it was the only platform fully dedicated to free speech, it saw words that had been posted and protected manifesting in real-life violence, in rioting, and even murder. Now, Q hasn't made a post since December of 2020, but the effects of that movement have had a ripple effect in our country. Words spread online and manifesting themselves into real-life actions, the consequences of which we will probably see for years and maybe decades to come. As Brennan reflected on the foundation of the site and his calls for its removal, he said this. He said, "I founded 8chan in a moment of profound naivete I expected users to talk about anonymous, taboo topics. I never expected it would leak out into real life as often as it has. Now, I'm not here this morning to attack free speech or First Amendment rights. There is a lot that's right and beautiful about the way that our U.S. Constitution was written. But at the same time, there is profound potential for us to claim our right to say anything we want. It shouldn't impact you at the cost of someone else's well-being or safety or dignity or life. In our day and age, what we say and what we should say aren't always aligned, and sometimes knowing what's okay and what isn't is a little murky in our world. But thankfully, the Bible doesn't leave our words unmoderated, unfiltered, or unaddressed. The Bible doesn't claim that our words have no real-life consequences for ourselves or for anyone else. The Bible is clear. Words have power. They can influence what we think about certain things. They can tell us stories and build our faith. They can restore broken relationships and forge new connections. Think about the last piece of really powerful words of affirmation that you received. Maybe it was from a friend or a family member or a coworker. Think about how you felt that moment that you received it. Maybe you felt loved or valued or embraced. Words like, I love you, or I'm proud of you, or I respect you. Words like, I'm sorry, or me too, or you're not alone. Mark Twain once said that he could live for 2 months on a good compliment, and I am just the same way. Words mean something. Words have power. They can breathe life into us, but they can suck the life out of us too. And I'd imagine we can all think back to a time or story in our lives when words were said that hurt us, a name we were once called, words that were shouted at us in anger, criticism that was said about you when you weren't in the room. And words like that, they can cut us deep and stick with us for a long time. I'm what? That's what they think about me, about my work? And some of you, you're still carrying those scars of those things that were said to you or said about you maybe a long time ago. Well, we are smack dab in the middle of a sermon series on the book of James, which we are calling James and the Giant Preach. And a few weeks ago, we talked about double-mindedness, how all of us have parts of our minds that don't agree with themselves. We value one thing, and under the surface, sometimes without our even realizing it, we value something totally contradictory at the exact same time. And this morning, we are going to talk about one of the ways that double-mindedness manifests itself in our actions through our words. Now, in the passage that was read a few minutes ago, James writes this. He says, "Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark." Ancient Hebrews had this idea that once a word was spoken, it took on a life of its own. It was a spark like a forest fire. After a word comes out of your mouth, you can't control it, can't manage it, can't say where it spreads or how it's understood. Back then, words were like sparks that could set a whole forest on fire. And sometimes hearing rumors or criticism about ourselves through the grapevine, it can feel like a spark we can't contain anymore. We can't control those kind of words. We don't know who's heard them or sometimes even why they were said, but they can cut us deep and sometimes stick with us for longer than those words of affirmation ever did. Say you get an evaluation from your boss, and she tells you a whole bunch of things that you do so well, and one little piece of constructive feedback or a way to improve. And sometimes all we remember is that one little piece of criticism. Say you get an A on a test at school, and your teacher could tell you how well you did, how insightful you were. You could have gotten almost every answer right. Almost. But the one marked wrong, sometimes that's the one that sticks in our memories. You get 100 emails, and 99 of them are, "You are so incredible and amazing," and one has one little criticism in it. And so often that's the one that we remember. Now, don't get me wrong. sometimes we need to hear words of constructive feedback. They can make us better, more mature, more self-aware, and we would be wise to listen to them. Doesn't mean they won't hurt sometimes. And when they're spoken maliciously or reactively, words aren't just words anymore. They can become weapons, like little sparks of fire in a forest, and they can leave us feeling betrayed, burned, misunderstood, ashamed, alone, even angry for a long time. It's easy to read this passage in James and assume it's only talking about the big, grand betrayals of trust, the malicious words spoken out of revenge, the willful gossip and triangulation, the intent to make our neighbor look bad in front of another neighbor. And because I'm not typically tempted toward those things, maybe, I assume that this passage isn't really about me. It's about those other people who talk about me, but I would never do that to someone, usually. But here's the thing. Forest fires don't start as fiery infernos, do they? They start as single sparks, single flames that ignite and spread. Maybe we exaggerate just a little bit about a friend's flaws when they aren't around. Maybe we start venting about a coworker at the water cooler and we slip in something that isn't totally how it happened just because it makes the story a little bit better or it makes us look a little bit more interesting. Maybe we talk up our relationship with someone who's in a position of power or who's well-liked to make ourselves seem just a tad more important and the person we're talking to just a tad less connected. We can get really clever with the ways that we're using our words, and sometimes we can even convince ourselves we're not even doing it. But subtly, maybe even subconsciously, we're lighting a spark that could set a whole forest on fire. We try to justify it. We soften the blow sometimes. We try to excuse why we're saying it. We start our sentences with words like, I'm just being honest, or I love him, but, or I just need to vent for a minute about, or she's great, but, or don't tell her I told you this, but. And if we have prefaced our sentences with something like that, it's likely that we're double-minded in our speech. Whenever we feel the need to take a jab at someone else for no other reason than to make them look bad or to make ourselves look good, we have split brain. But all throughout the Bible, we're given the message that what we say can tear whole families and communities and even our own lives apart. Take a look back at James 3. It says, "Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell." The Apostle Paul treats it this way in Romans 1 as he describes those who are habitually sinful. He says, "Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning." Yikes. Paul puts gossips and backstabbers in the same list as murderers and haters of God. Why? Because God's heart is for authentic, transparent, loving community, and backstabbing, malicious talk just destroys all possibilities of that. In our passage this morning, James says that what we say actually has power over who we are. It says, we can make a large horse go wherever we want by means of a small bit in its mouth, and a small rudder makes a huge ship turn wherever the pilot chooses to go, even though the winds are strong. In the same way, the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches. Even if we start off not really believing negative things about a person, not really, a small comment can direct where we actually go in our minds and how we actually feel in our hearts about them. If I speak or listen to negative things about a person, it's like starting a fire in my own heart as well. And eventually, I'll begin to actually see them that way. I'll look for more flaws to point out. Spark after spark after spark. And it can solidify my distaste for them in my own mind and heart before I ever saw the forest catch on fire. On the other hand, if I am consistently speaking well of someone, if I'm consistently hearing positive things about them, I might actually start to believe those things, spark by spark by spark. So if it's destructive to speak negatively about others, why do we keep doing it? Most of us, I'd imagine, we struggle with this one on a regular basis. We struggle with it at home and at work and when we're driving. And even if we can refrain from speaking our negative thoughts, we're still thinking them. Why? Well, sometimes our cutting words about others are driven by ambition. We want to get ahead. We want to push our own agenda. So we play with the truth just a little bit. We embellish to close the deal, to steamroll things to go in the direction that we want. We exaggerate, we criticize, we twist, just a little bit. Sometimes our cutting words are driven by ambition, but sometimes they're driven by animosity. We don't like a certain person or a group of people. They've rubbed us the wrong way, they've hurt us in the past, they're hard for us to love or to understand, so we label them, we stigmatize them. We reduce them to just a few negative character traits, or we make assumptions about them, narratives about them that may or may not be true. Or more commonly, we talk about them because they hurt us. Maybe they said something about us, assumed something about us, and we don't know what to do with that hurt. So subtly, subconsciously, we get revenge by harming their reputation. Of course, we would never think of this as revenge, but it manifests itself that way, or it feels that way when they hear about it. Hurt people hurt people. And we see this in kids all the time, right? One kid says something mean that hurts another kid, and the kid that got hurt with tears in their eyes lashes out back at something that will hurt the first kid, and then they're both crying, still lashing out. It's so obvious in kids. But we don't grow out of this very easily. Our instinct when we hurt is to hurt back. Sometimes our words are driven by pain, sometimes by ambition, sometimes by animosity, but I think that more often they're driven by fear. At some level, all of us want to belong. We all want to be approved of, to be on the inside. And that desire is good. It's God-given. It was hardwired into us by God. We were made for a real and deep, intimate connection with God and with each other. Those connections, they take time and trust building. But they can be small sparks that create joy and safety and love in relationships and in our lives. The desire for connection is good. But here's the root of the problem, is that on some level, I'm afraid that maybe I'm not good enough for that kind of connection. I get insecure in my own relationships and my own ability to connect. I think that maybe where I am or who I am is not good enough for those kinds of deep connections. So instead, I hotwire them. I hotwire the connections, circumventing the long, hard work it takes to build a trusting relationship and connection, and connecting instead about a common enemy, a common annoyance with another acquaintance, a common frustration with them that you and I can bond over. We think that maybe if we pick someone else apart, then maybe, just maybe, those around us will accept us, that we'll finally belong. And in our world, it's almost accepted party etiquette that if you can't think of something to say, you can always talk badly about someone else. We huddle together. We share secrets. We demonize a coworker or someone else at church. We make jabs at friends when they aren't around. We put down a family member to other family members. We pass judgments together. And we walk away for a second feeling a little more in, a little better liked, a little more accepted, just for a minute. It's what we call triangulation. Triangulation. We talk a lot about this at Highrock. So imagine that Pastor Matt and Pastor Angie and I are all equal sides of a triangle. If I say something negative about Matt to Angie, it pushes the sides of our triangle closer, Angie's and mine, and Matt's side further away. It creates distance between Angie and me and Matt. It separates us from him. But for a little while, I get to feel the closeness with Angie that I want because now we share this secret or this common frustration or this common annoyance with Matt. But this kind of talk, it ends up serving as a big highlighter on my own insecurities. Because more often than not, we end up judging or criticizing others in the areas where we feel most concerned about our own inadequacy. I found someone else to judge or criticize as a way to call attention away from my own flaws or my fears that maybe I don't measure up. And if I'm questioning my own worth, my own body, my own parenting, at least I can convince myself that I'm doing better than Matt. There are days when we take a jab at someone, sometimes even unintentionally, and I think, why did I say that? When I take a step back, I realize that I have my own insecurities in that area or in that relationship, maybe even pain I don't know what else to do with. Because if I can point the finger and convince myself that she's doing worse than I am at something, then I don't have to feel as badly about myself. So I know in my own life that if I'm taking jabs at another person, even just in my own thoughts, it might be an indication that I'm insecure in the area that I'm judging them in. But in the end, no matter how good we think it will feel to tell that secret, to exaggerate that story, to exaggerate about another person, unkind, critical words about another person only make us feel unsafe and eventually lonely. Because it doesn't take too long before we get that sinking feeling, do they talk that way about me? And it hurts our relationships because when the person we're talking about comes up to the conversation, we wonder if they know. We can't look them in the eye anymore because we've invited deception and criticism into the room, whether they know it or not. And if we want to stop, if at some point we realize we've formed a bad habit that makes us feel unkind, unsafe, or untrue, we wonder if we don't participate the next time around, if we'll just be the next target of the group conversation. If we stand up to the group who's doing the criticizing, will they torch us next? Gossip breeds gossip, spark by spark. Our kids, they pick up on this. They overhear how we talk about our own parents, our in-laws, our friends we disagree with, the other parents at school who make different choices. They hear the way that we talk about our spouses when our spouses aren't around, about their teachers, about those people in that political party. They hear us tell them to speak kindly about others, that if we don't have something nice to say, then we shouldn't say anything at all. But what are they observing in the way that we talk? Kids, they'll learn more about how to behave from what they overhear us saying than from anything else we want to teach them. So if we want our kids to be people who encourage others, who speak kindly to and about others, who use their speech to affirm and build others up, we have to start with taming our own tongues. Shared dislikes can create faster bonds than shared likes, but they don't actually facilitate real or lasting connections with anyone. They make us look untrustworthy because the last person I'm going to feel safe trusting and sharing life with is the public critic or the person who has told me secrets or gossip or criticism about another person who's not in the room. People who gossip with you gossip about you. People who share secrets will likely share yours. Fear breeds fear, spark by spark. Putting others down doesn't forge real connections. It's just another mask to find validation when we're feeling insecure. And the more we do it, the less likely we are to get the connections we actually need and actually want. Because in the end, our own words about others can erode our trust that people aren't doing the same thing to us. A tiny spark can set a whole forest on fire. It's no wonder that James went on to say this: people can tame all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Sometimes it praises our Lord and Father, and sometimes it curses those who have been made in the image of God. And so blessing and cursing come pouring out of the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, this should not be so. James makes it very clear, no one can tame the tongue. So where do we find our hope? Our hope starts with an understanding of the way that God speaks of us. Take a look with me at Ephesians 1. It says, "Speak highly of God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has spoken highly of us with every spiritual accolade in the heavenly realms." When God speaks of you, God uses every single word of praise in God's vocabulary to describe you. Whenever God thinks or speaks of Carlos or Rich, Matthew or Michael, God speaks great accolades. That same God, whenever God speaks about Meredith or Monica, Canan or Katie, that God says high praises. God looks at you and says she is holy. He is beloved. They are cherished. I delight in her. They are redeemed, restored, forgiven, wanted, accepted. They are my children. He is my son. She is my daughter. They're my heirs. All I have is theirs. I love them. It is not that we are inherently worthy of God's praises. It's that God has chosen to give them to us even when we didn't deserve it. It's that when God looks at us, God sees us in and through the Son as beloved children, adopted into God's family, people bought with a price, and in whom God's Spirit dwells. And once we can realize that God speaks well of us, even when we didn't deserve it, we'll begin to see others around us the way that God sees us, as people made in the image of God, beloved children, people bought with a price, worthy of greater dignity than the way that we've been speaking about them. Each of us, you and me, your boss and coworkers and friends, your parents and professors, your husband or wife, your siblings and students, are all created in the image of the same God who has spoken so well of you. And once we're connected relationally to God through the work of Jesus and the reputation that we inherit in him, we are members and representatives of an entirely different relational system. We're no longer part of a zero-sum game where we pay back what we get, where we hurt to the degree that we've been hurt, where we protect ourselves and advance our own position or status. No, now we are part of a new system where love and grace overflow, where there isn't a limit on favor or blessing, where to love my neighbor as I love myself means that your reputation is as important to me as my own. Instead, infinite love has forever unbalanced the equation, and as we reap the benefits of Christ, we extend the benefits from Christ. So for some of us, this work starts with letting that sink in. It starts with paying attention to how we talk to ourselves or to the words that we believe about ourselves. Some of us talk to ourselves in a way we'd never talk to someone we love. But if all we're breathing in is judgment toward ourselves, then that ends up being what we breathe out all over our friends and neighbors. And maybe we need to start reminding ourselves of Christ's truth in the midst of all that judgmental self-talk. Some of us need to start paying attention to our own words about ourselves, but others of us need to start paying attention to what we're saying and thinking about other people. Maybe it's time to have that hard conversation we've been avoiding. Maybe it's time to share the reality of how someone hurt you rather than shrinking back or hurting them back. Maybe it's time to forgive someone so you can both be free and move on from that wound. Maybe it's time to look for where others are succeeding and tell them, talk about it, celebrate it in front of the whole company, instead of pointing out all the places that they're failing. This takes practice. It takes one spark at a time, and sometimes it means learning to speak well of people even when you don't like them right away or ever. So for the next 24 hours, I want to encourage you. Every time you catch yourself thinking a negative thought about someone, try to reverse the course. Find one thing you like about them, and simply, internally or externally, acknowledge it. Write it down. Speak a word of affirmation to them at work tomorrow. CC the boss. Tell them you love them at home. Or simply acknowledge in your heart that they are made in the image of God. This might mean learning to change the subject when others are gossiping or taking jabs at other people. It might mean going to the person that you've been gossiping about and confessing, hey, I haven't been honoring you with the way that I've been talking about you. And it'll hurt, but at least they know that they can start to trust you again. It might mean signing our name when we give feedback, or only posting things online that we'd say in the presence of those we're posting about. Some of us need to have that hard conversation, to be honest about that thing that we've been trying to avoid. But if that's you, I want to encourage you to embody it. If you can, talk about it in person. Look them in the eye. Lead with grace. I'm not going anywhere. Follow with truth. And that's why I'm telling you this, so that we can grow together. Because love breeds love. spark by spark. Words have power. They have the power to breathe life into us or to suck life out of us. They can shape our communities, our relationships, our church, and even our souls, spark by spark. And isn't it interesting that in the end, God didn't save us just by thinking about it? God saved us through God's word, the word that became a human being, who just before he was betrayed gave thanks, who in the face of injustice spoke words of reconciliation, who even as he was being falsely accused stayed silent. And then in his final moments, when they shamed him and beat him and hoisted him up on the cross, the words he spoke were not words of bitterness or gossip or complaint, but forgiveness and life and love, even for the people who had put him down, even for the people who had wronged him, even for you and for me. And so this morning, what would it look like for Highrock to be a church where we spoke about each other the way God speaks of us? What would it look like if we consistently looked for and named a person's strengths, their gifts, and called them the names that God calls them? Beloved, cherished, redeemed, restored, forgiven, wanted, accepted. Well, I can imagine that little by little, it would start to look like the kind of community that God envisioned from the Garden of Eden, the kind of community where we would be ourselves with one another without fear of being criticized or manipulated or rejected, without fear of being put down or excluded or ostracized, without fear of being unsafe when we're not in the room. Because when we can start to speak words of life and love to and about each other, then eventually we'll start to believe them. Love breeds love. Spark